entitled What God Requires. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with tens of thousands of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. Our second reading is Mark chapter 13, verses 1 to 8, and is titled Destruction of the Temple Foretold. As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another, and all will be thrown down." When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will this be, and what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished?" And Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumours of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is the beginning of the birth pangs." And this is the gospel of Christ.
All very dramatic, wasn't it? You're probably thinking, what the heck's he going to talk about here? One of the things that I actually really love about having set readings for the whole year in the church is that you can't actually just pick your pet passages. And, I'm a big believer in that. It helps us have a variety of ideas, have to struggle with all the different kind of theologies in the Bible, as all mean. But I must admit, when I was assigned Mark chapter 13, I was tempted to sort of drop that idea and try and think, how could we maybe focus on something else? Because if we're honest, this sounds a little bit like the rantings of some kind of end of the world nutter, doesn't it? Did you feel that as we heard that? It feels very different to our suburban lifestyles in Sydney in 2024. And it all actually kicks off with a kind of dramatic and cranky declaration by Jesus that the temple is going to be completely destroyed, totally obliterated. And this dramatic declaration is actually set up by a compliment by one of Jesus' disciples. Jesus' disciple, he says, "Wow, teacher, look at those magnificent stones and those enormous buildings. This is really something." You can feel he's moved by the awesome presence of the temple. And Jesus' response is what? It's, You see those enormous buildings? Not one of those magnificent stones is going to be left on top of the other. It's a pretty strong response, isn't it? So why this response? So to understand this response, we actually need to appreciate what just came before it. And Ian actually gave us an excellent talk last week about this that you should go back and have a look at. Because just before the disciples' awestruck compliment about the temple, Jesus and his disciples watch a poor widow drop 2 small coins into the temple coffers. Clink, clink. And I imagine Jesus shaking his head as he tells his disciples, he's looking over at this scene, he says, that poor widow just put in the temple coffers everything that she had to live on. Everything. You see, Jesus wasn't actually a huge fan of the temple. He wasn't a great fan of its leadership, in fact, because for Jesus, the temple was a little bit like a rotten apple. It seemed like juicy and beautiful on the outside, but when you actually bit into it, it didn't taste so good. Tithes and offerings, in fact, for the temple, if you look back on the Torah, were actually meant to be redistributed to help those who most needed that, including who, do you think? Poor widows. So having one of the disciples, in this instance actually raving about the temple, oh, look how wonderful it is, after making that point, doesn't go down real well. Does that make sense? I also think that to fully appreciate the angstiness and edginess in this whole section of Mark 13, we actually need to really appreciate the desperate socio-political context of the first readers of Mark's Gospel. Because most scholars believe that Mark's Gospel was written around about AD 70. And maybe, there's debate whether it was a little bit before or a little bit after that. And what happened in AD 70 was that the Roman General Titus literally burnt down the whole of the Jerusalem temple. The whole thing was burnt to the ground, not one stone left upon another. It's interesting too when you look at the history because just a few years prior to AD 70, there was actually quite a lot of things that were different. So There was a growing hope that the time in history had finally come for Israel to be restored to its former glory, like in the days of King David. You see, there'd actually been a Jewish revolt against the Roman colonising administrators, and that revolt had been successful. And not only that, the Romans had come in to put down the revolt, but the Jewish guerrilla forces were successful in actually defeating the Romans, who retreated and left Israel independent for a good couple of years. Now, you can imagine what ideas that gave rise to in Israel at that time, can't you? It gave rise to a belief that this was actually the first fruits, the first evidence that God is going to restore us to our greatness. You can imagine it, can't you? Yet just a few years later, what do you think happens? Well, we know what happens, don't we? A few years later, Rome returns for their revenge. And they put down the rebellion across the whole of the country, starting right in Galilee, and they gut Jerusalem and they burn the temple utterly to the ground. And I think if you understand that, you kind of maybe get to feel more why there's this kind of sense of be alert and the edginess that's there. It's very different to our suburban life here, right? So the issue for the writer of Mark's community was this. The issue they were facing was, what do I put my trust in when the walls of my secure world fall apart? I mean, where's God? Should I draw into kind of an eye for an eye vengeance reaction? Is that what I should do? Be understandable, wouldn't it? Do I withdraw into magical thinking about God returning to wipe out the enemy? Do I become a cynic, simply just withdrawing from life and thinking, well, let's just exploit others as I've been exploited, because what's the point? What's the point? And, our context, of course, is very different to AD 70, but don't we have a similar question in our lives? I mean, what do I put my trust in when the walls of my secure world just ends up falling apart? Just a couple of weeks ago, one of my mother's dearest friends lost her life partner, a beautiful man, 60 years. Her greatest wall has just been crumbled. So what now? When our health and our bodies start crumbling down, what now? When the so-called future leader of a free world says, drill, baby, drill, in the middle of a climate crisis, what now? When alliances we trusted to protect the rights of minorities, including trans people, and even strong democratic institutions, when they begin to crumble, we do start to ask ourselves, well, what now? How do we move forward? I mean, do we turn to resentment that seeks to hurt as we have been hurt? I mean, do we hide away, giving on the struggle in our own context just to be a loving presence to our small circle because it just gets too hard to be that presence anymore? Do we give up on advocating for climate change? Do we give up on advocating for human rights? Is it time to give up and just live out our days saying, oh, well, eat, drink, be merry, for tomorrow you die? Well, not so for the Jesus that Mark presents us. In fact, if you look at chapter 12, just a few episodes before Jesus' cursing of the temple, we're clearly told what really matters. And it's not a human-made temple or anything external. No, the most important thing to embrace is the inseparability of loving God and loving neighbour. You see, as we do good to the least of these, we are connecting to the presence of God. In fact, the more that we know God, the more we love. And the more we love, the more we actually know God. The two, in Jesus' thinking, can't be separated. And as Jesus says back in chapter 12, it sums up the whole of the laws and the prophets. This inner temple, you see, that Jesus is calling us to nurture. That's a temple that can't be destroyed by the fires of an invading army. It can't be wiped out by a sword or a gun or a bully, or even by the loss of someone very dear to us. When our world is literally shaken to the core, we need to remember that our calling is to nurture that can be deep within us. But Jesus also uses some weird language here. He taught, and I hope you're starting to get why the weirdness was there, because in the midst of this crumbling war-filled terror, Jesus says, be alert. Be alert. Be sure that no one leads you astray, because many are going to come in my name and say, I'm he, follow me. And the community the writer Mark wrote to, they would have actually been under enormous pressure, don't you think? Just imagine it, what it might have been like to be back then. There would have been enormous pressure, for example, to join the armed resistance, to keep believing that the warrior god, King David, would give them success. The warrior god of King David, I should say, rather than King David. And others would have been urging Mark's community, well, just head for the hills and live a life of passivity. So there's all these voices Just hide away. Don't get involved in the risky business of rebuilding and advocating for the poor and broken. Just look out for yourself. And Jesus is urging, as these different Messiah-like voices come in, claiming authority to follow particular ways, beware, let no one lead you astray. Keep the path. And I think we also need to remain alert. What might be the courageous path in our lives that we're invited to participate in? It could be as small as just opening our heart, which is hardening, just to care a little bit again. As everything seems to be falling apart, just keep caring, keep loving. Or it might be even something a little bit bigger of not, well, I don't want to compare, but something like joining an alliance to work for justice in some aspect of our world with others. So we need to never give up on believing that our call, when the walls start falling down, is to keep nurturing that beautiful presence of God in us. Yet sometimes, the reality is that false Messiah voices become very alive in us, don't they? We want revenge. There's this voice that calls to give up, and I think that's a very human experience. And I think it's okay for us to sit with those voices and to be aware that they're present within us. Yet, perhaps as we do, we can pray something like this prayer. God, give us the strength to hold on, strength to let go. God, give us the strength to hold on, strength to let go. That's a prayer that often we need in our hearts and mind, and maybe over time we can find that something grows within us because of that love which we're seeking to nurture can grow, and suddenly it's love is born with a dark and troubled face when hope is dead. And in the most unlikely place, love is born. Love is always born. And Jesus of Mark's Gospel, there's a lot in this chapter 13, but there's one other thing that I think is worth reflecting on from this Gospel. Because Jesus talks, again, it sounds pretty weird to us now, but he says nation. Here in that passage, nation will rise against nation. Kingdoms will rise against kingdoms. There will be earthquakes and famine. And look, the way that I see this potent reminder, it's a reminder actually to bring some perspective to our broken walls and our shattered lives, to bring some perspective as you're in the midst of suffering. Because during a crisis, we forget sometimes that crisis and suffering is actually part of being human, and that it has always been a part of being human. To be human is to, let me assure you, and I think we know, is to suffer. To be human is to suffer, and to remember that others have also suffered, that right now millions are suffering. And I think there's a need to bring and I think this is what Jesus is getting at, you need to bring a long historical lens to your life when the walls are falling down. Because institutions and countries and people get smashed. This is the story of history. And the temptation for short-term easy fixes is abundant. Yet we need to fix, I think Jesus is saying, fix your minds on the long game. Whilst even accepting that, like Moses, we may never actually ever enter the promised land of what we're fighting for. We may never get there. You know what? Who knows that more than anyone else in this country? First Nations communities know that. They know what patience is, I'll tell you. Go and talk to them about patience. And so too, there's Black America. Way back when the black Africans were enslaved in America, and also during the civil rights struggle, one black spiritual reminded people very much of the long game. And it goes like this. You probably know it. You can sing along. Oh, Mary, don't you weep, don't you woe. Oh, Mary, don't you weep, don't you woe. Pharaoh's army got drowned. Oh, Mary, don't you weep. So let's all try it, hey? Oh, Mary, don't you weep, don't you woe. Oh, Mary, don't you weep, don't you woe. Pharaoh's army got drowned. Oh, Mary, don't you weep. I mean, wow, listen to the theology pregnant in that, right? It's so powerful because, it's talking about Mary of Bethany weeping for her brother Lazarus to be resurrected, just like Marys all over were weeping in suffering, crying out for their children. But God weeps with us. Resurrection is coming, the long lens. And then you've got that Pharaoh's army got drowned. A reminder that that story of God being on the side of the little people, the oppressed and the suffering, just like in Egypt, where the people became known as God's chosen ones. Who were the ones who became known as God's chosen ones? It was the ones who were the slaves in Egypt. And it's a reminder, I think. It's a powerful reminder from our brothers and sisters of history that, hey, this is a long struggle. But never forget, when the walls are falling down, that every little thing you do, whether it's the wall of someone beautiful in your life or your health or it's some bigger cause, remember every little bit of seeking to be more loving, it is so important and it matters. It's beautiful. So, as we finish, I guess there's a few things from this text that I think we can hold on to. So when the walls fall down, let's remember that God, who is love and calls us to love, has not fallen. God, who is love and who calls us to love, has not fallen. And maybe be alert to those voices that draw you into wrong thinking of vengefulness and despair. Be alert, be aware. And maybe nurture the temple of divine love within you so that you continue to love others courageously. Continue to nurture that love even when it's hard. And then just as importantly, play the long game. Play the long game, remembering that all our small acts, as little as they may be, of seeking love and justice in this community, in our lives and beyond, they all matter. They always matter. Amen. Thanks, everyone.
Some words from the poet R.S. Thomas. Life is not hurrying on to a receding future, nor hankering after an imagined past. It is the turning aside, like Moses, to the miracle of the lit bush. As we take time now to turn aside, to pause, to be in this moment, help us to recognize the goodness of this day, of this moment, and the love that sustains and gives life. We recognize the temptations to sometimes despair, regret, stew over old wounds, wonder at what might have been. Help us to turn again to the wonder of love, to turn to the experience of forgiveness, turn to the potential that hope brings. May love and life and joy come alive in each of us this very day. And we pray for those who wield power and hold enormous responsibility in our world. Open them to the still small voice, the needs of the vulnerable child, the frightened mother, the despairing and the hungry. Help the powerful to glimpse the struggles of the other and to open their hearts. And so we remember this morning conflicts in Ukraine and Russia, the Middle East, and the often forgotten struggles of Sudan. Be with us here at Reesby as we seek to follow the way of Christ. Give us grace and wisdom in our relationships, in our decision-making, and in our dreaming for the future. Sustain us in the everyday tasks we are called to. Grant to us perseverance and patient trust. We give thanks for the energy and time that people give, often in quiet and unseen ways, to our life together. Give us now courage to love the world as Christ does, to see the world through Christ's eyes, and to be the hands of Christ for friend and stranger. Amen.